So we'll use one branch of legacy media as an example to share a brief history of how it became so biased towards regression. And we'll say this is the branch that has possibly been the most biased in our lifetimes, which has been AM hate squawk radio. And we'll make what should be essentially an obvious statement, which is that we support the official narrative of World War II, and those who don't speak in code in support of the Third Reich. Modern talk radio, as a major force in America, started in 1926, when Catholic priest Father Charles E. Coughlin took to the airwaves. By the mid-1930s, as many as a full third of the entire nation listened to his weekly broadcasts. His downfall and the end of the talk radio era he both essentially created and dominated came in the early 1940s when the nation was at war and Hitler was shipping millions of Jews to the death camps. Coughlin launched into hard-right anti-Semitic tirades in his broadcasts, blaming an international Jewish conspiracy for communism, the Great Depression, World War II, and most of the world's other ills. His sudden shift to very extreme politics, as he both supported and lauded Mussolini and Hitler before the camps in Europe were revealed, eventually disgusted the majority of his listeners, and he retired from radio to return to his parish duties, where he died in relative obscurity. Between 1949 and 1987, the Fairness Doctrine was a long-standing policy by the Federal Communications Commission that required broadcasters to give airtime to controversial issues of public importance, and to do so in a fair manner without editorial input from advertisers. Many say the Fairness Doctrine came about partially in part because of Coughlin's dark decline. There was a forward thinker and talker on the radio for years after Coughlin named Alan Berg, who sought to bring balance to America's airwaves, speaking more to a middle class and thus pro-democratic flavoring, and did so while honoring the doctrine while also being fabulously popular, no problem. But like the Bill Hicks joke, did you ever realize that we often live in a world where good men are murdered while mediocre hacks thrive? John Kennedy murdered, Gandhi murdered, Martin Luther King Jr. murdered, Reagan wounded. Berg was sadly machine gunned to death by extreme reactionaries likely from the Aryan nation. But after the FCC stopped the Fairness Doctrine under that reincarnation of Satan in 1987, broadcast corporations stopped having to worry about broadcasting in the public interest. So the now red cult figured out about 40 plus years ago, since the elimination of the Fairness Doctrine, it was all about turning the media into something that was impartial into something that was very partial. Because the main way that stations programmed in the public interest was by producing news, real actual journalistic non-infotainment news. Once Alzheimer's brain lifted that requirement, news was no longer the cost of keeping your broadcast license. Instead, the news divisions used the various networks came under sway of ratings and profits, so it became an opportunity to make more money and increasingly dumbed down and salacious reporting. Not coincidentally, just a few months after the FCC did away with the Fairness Doctrine, another ghoul who's surely burning in the fires of hell for all of eternity, Rush Limbaugh, launched his show. And the years following, regressive reactionaries hiding under the label of conservatism put propagandists like him on stations nationwide, so that listeners could tune in to hate radio from pretty much anywhere in the country at any time, day or night. And station managers discovered there was a loyal group of radio listeners who embraced Rush's brand of overt, hard, regressive spin, believing every word he said, even though he himself acknowledged he was full of shit and not a real journalist and claimed his show was just entertainment, to avoid a reemergence of the Fairness Doctrine. The success, though, of Rush led local radio station programmers to look to more of the same, and there was a sudden demand for Rush clone talkers who could meet the needs of the nation's Rush-bonded, brain-drained listeners. And then the all-right-wing talk radio format emerged, dominated by Limbaugh and Limbaugh clones in both style and political viewpoint. This was given a huge boost by the Telecommunications Act of 1996 under the Clinton administration, a regressive light corporate Dem yes, as well as a few other smaller laws and changes in FCC policy that let a small handful of mega corpses buy up all the radio stations, TV stations, and newspapers in communities from coast to coast. Hence the consolidation we've previously mentioned in this series. The vast majority of those radio stations were then programmed with hyper-corporate friendly radio, which speaks only for the rich and their needs while distracting through misdirection. Since modern American regressive reactionary politics only speak for the richest 1% of the population, how do you get dirt-poor Appalachian coal miners to vote for robber baron weasels? Through constant lies on the radio over decades. In rural areas where people regularly drive long distances just for routine things like grocery shopping, radio has been and is still incredibly important. And without the Fairness Doctrine and ownership rules in place, other broadcasters started to be more concerned about their bottom lines instead of the public interest. One of the main reasons the GOP, now the GQP, has even historically had a chance in many congressional elections with such historically unpopular policies is that in low population rural states, the only voices on the radio are promoting said regressive policies. And as previously mentioned, there have historically been over 1,500 regressive right-wing only commercial radio stations and around 900 dark imperial religious nonprofit stations pretending to have something to do with spirituality, almost all blasting out a pro-reactionary regressive message 24/7. And into the 2020s, this pattern sadly still continues at times. Regressive aligned businessmen have bought over 300 Spanish language radio stations across the country and put on them wrong-ring Spanish language hosts trying to bend the Hispanic vote away from the democratic and toward the authoritarian. The domination of talk radio by a fringe hard right that represents the political views of only a small segment of America has resulted in decades of talk radio stations across the nation never even running an occasional centrist, let alone any sort of progressive show in the midst of their all-the-time programming day, but instead only blasting out hard fringe regressive squawk that represents the political views of, again, only the robber baron class, because corrupt reactionaries and their investors were the first to the market with a consistent and predictable programming slant. Now, a disclaimer regarding our multiple references to hell in this insight that were used mainly in a joking sense. Of course, we don't actually think hell is a real thing. Heaven and hell are simply marketing fictions created by the false versions of religion called corporate religion to sway guilt and control. Since our documentaries can take years to make, these insights were created with the goal of us being in front of camera, providing you more consistent content. They are independently made and often feel for us like throwing a Kleenex into the Grand Canyon alone while surrounded by tumbleweeds. So if you find value in these shorter insights, please do the usual things that favor the ghost in the machine algorithms. We never run any ads, so also consider navigating over to our overarching website, nilesheckman.org, where you can acquire our longer form content such as our films or narrated essays bundled in volumes, or even become an annual member for a very modest fee. Cheers for watching and/or listening.